What's the difference between theism, atheism, and agnosticism? Something I've noticed in the comments is that we are all using these terms, but we're not always using them in the same sense. And as a result of that, some of our disagreements are more about how we're defining these terms rather than about the underlying beliefs. So to help us better understand each other going forward, to help us have more productive conversations, I'm going to try to define these terms in this video and suggest an easy way that we can discuss our beliefs with less confusion. Let's start with theism. I think most of us are using this term the same way, and that's with this first definition, the belief that God exists. That's it. It doesn't tell us who God is or what God is like. It simply means that a person believes that God exists. So some definitions of theism include belief in one or multiple gods. However, when we are talking about multiple gods, we also have the ability to use the term polytheism, which can reduce some confusion there. The second term, atheism, is where I see most of the controversy happen because we use both of its definitions regularly. So the first definition is the belief that God does not exist. In this sense, it means that a person believes there is no God. And speaking for myself, this is typically what I mean when I use the word atheism. But there is another definition that's subtly different. Atheism can also mean the absence of belief in God. And in this sense, a person may not be claiming that God doesn't exist. Rather, they might just be unconvinced that God does exist. That second definition of atheism overlaps with a common definition of agnosticism, a person who is not convinced that God exists, but who is also not convinced that God doesn't exist. Or in a broader sense, agnosticism can also mean a person who believes that it's just impossible to know whether or not God exists, and so the person, they're withholding judgment. Personally, I find it helpful to think about these terms on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum is theism, the belief that God exists, and at the other end of the spectrum is atheism, the belief that God does not exist. And in the middle, we have agnosticism, where a person is not really convinced either way. And as we move towards either end of the spectrum, our level of confidence increases. For example, it's possible that someone might be a very convinced theist or a moderately convinced theist. Likewise, someone might be a very convinced atheist or a moderately convinced atheist, where agnostics sit in the middle because they're not really convinced in either direction. You now have a clear idea of how I'm using these terms in my videos, but I think a best practice we can all take out into the real world in our conversations is just to ask people what they mean. So if someone says that they're a theist or an atheist or agnostic and the distinction is relevant to the conversation, then we can just respectfully ask them to clarify what they mean before moving the discussion forward. That way we can avoid any misunderstandings and make it easier to identify where we're actually agreeing and actually disagreeing. I'm curious to what you think. Do you define these terms in the same way that I do, or do you prefer different definitions? And I'm also curious how you define yourself and what that means. Of course, if you have other thoughts on this topic or questions about other topics related to Christianity, feel free to put those in the comments too, and I will do my best to respond there or in a future video. And if you want to see more content like this, you can peruse the other videos on my channel or hit the subscribe button just below this video, and then I'll see you next week. Thank you.